Okay, so our next speaker is Donna Paul. Donna works for Cornell University's Produce Safety Alliance, PSA, as a Southwest Regional Extension Associate. The PSA has developed a standardized educational curriculum to train growers and other stakeholders on the good agricultural practices and the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rules. Donna will be organizing and helping present these PSA trainings in the Southwest, as well as working with collaborators to develop other regionally and nationally relevant educational resources. Before working for the Produce Safety Alliance, Donna was a food safety educator at the University of Maryland, where she taught extension trainings and worked with growers to enact good agricultural practices. Today, Donna will be presenting her presentation titled FSMA Produce Safety Rule, a focus on soil amendments. And she will be covering Dr. Chris Walsh's sections as well. Welcome, Donna.
Thank you, Anastasia. Thanks for that nice introduction. And I just wanted to mention that if anybody has questions as I go through, feel free to type them out in the chat box. I can see the chat box, and if not, I will take questions at the end as well. So I also just wanted to mention I grew up on a vegetable farm in Maryland, so I'm pretty familiar with Maryland agriculture. It is a lot different than agriculture here out on the West Coast. So excuse me. So I just wanted to mention some key goals that I wanted to hit on today during my presentation. First, I'm going to give a quick overview of the Food Safety Modernization Act, specifically the produce safety rule portion of it. And I'm also going to talk mostly on biological soil amendments and major risks and recommendations, and really how this might affect some of you who work in nutrient management. And also give some resources on that maybe you can point if growers or anybody asks questions. I'll provide some resources that you can point them in the right direction. A lot of this does go, even though we're going to be primarily looking at microbial risks, a lot of this does go hand in hand with nutrient management. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Produce Safety Alliance, since we're going to be collaborating heavily with the University of Maryland Extension. And then I'll also show you some of Chris Walsh's slides on the produce safety resources that University of Maryland provides. And I'm very familiar with them, since this is primarily what I used to work with before working with Produce Safety Alliance. Okay, so first I wanted to give a good background on the produce safety rule. FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, it's very relevant and it's very important in agriculture, because this is the first ever mandatory standard for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding fresh produce. I'm going to talk a little bit about audit schemes later, but until now, most of the food safety practices have been either recommendations, so they've been recommendations that we ask growers to use, or they've been primarily upheld by third-party audits. And these might be grower third-party audits that a grower would need to undergo to sell to Wegmans or certain restaurants and wholesalers. The Produce Safety Rules is fairly new. It was published in the Federal Register on November 27th, 2015. And for those of you who may have heard about it, it was originally written into law in 2011. However, they released the original proposal, and they released a supplemental proposal a couple of years ago. And they heavily edited these regulations based on comments that they've received by growers, by industry, and marketing groups. So it's been a long time coming, and the final rules are out, and they became effective January 26th, so a little bit earlier in the year of this year. And I wanted to mention that they do have staggered compliance dates, and it does depend on the size of the growing operation. So you can see here in this chart, let's see, that a large business, and the farm size is based on the annual produce sales that it brings in. So a large farm is anything that makes over $500,000 gross in a year. And large farms have up to 2 years to comply. So they're looking at needing to comply by early 2018. Small businesses, small farms, make between $250,000 and $500,000. They have 3 years to comply. and very small businesses have up to 4 years. So FDA did try to stagger the compliance, and the thought is that large farmers may be able to take on some of the costs a little bit easier, incorporate them. They might have more resources to write a food safety plan, and so they decided to stagger those compliance dates. Initially, I'm not going to really mention the water quality standards that are in the produce safety rule today, but each farm has an additional 2 years to comply with the water quality standards. And there's a lot of microbial water testing that has to occur, and the thought is that since those standards are a little bit bulky, everybody has an additional 2 years to incorporate those practices. And I did want to mention some of the exemptions that are written into the produce safety rule. And I'm going to give a big caveat to these exemptions that even though these are exempt, if there is a produce outbreak, a microbial outbreak, so that might be a food safety outbreak due to Salmonella or E. coli in produce, then that exemption can be yanked. So for that reason, we're heavily recommending that growers still incorporate these recommended practices, even if they're technically exempt. And the exemptions are as listed in the produce safety rule. The first one, produce that is rarely consumed raw, is exempt from the produce safety rule. So these might be, in the picture, I have potatoes, artichokes, and the thought is that because they're not consumed raw, a lot of times they are cooked or canned, then they have that kill step, that sanitation step that would kill off any of the bacteria or microbes that they might be contaminated with. Produce destined for kill step processing, so like I mentioned, that might be tomato sauce, anything canned. Produce for personal or on-farm consumption. Again, if you're producing, aren't really regulating produce that you're consuming yourself or anything on your farm directly. And additionally, if you make less than, or if any grower makes less than $25,000 in all produce sales, and this is an average of 3 years, the last 3 years of funding. So essentially if you were a very, very small farm, they qualified as a very small business, then you are exempt from this regulation. And additionally, there is a qualified exemptions, and for those of you who are familiar with this rule, this was written in as the Tester Amendment in 2011 when FSMA was originally passed. And essentially the qualified exemptions, essentially if you are retailing or if you are a small enough grower is what it comes down to. So if a grower sells more than half of sell more than half of their produce, and the value was directly to qualified end users. So essentially this is the consumer of the food. So for example, if a grower is selling at farmers markets or CSAs, they're selling directly to their retailer. So they're selling directly to the consumer. Or if they're selling to a restaurant or retail food establishment that's local. And that's considered within the same state or within 275 miles from the farm. Additionally, so they have to be retailing, and the average monetary value has to be less than $500,000 annual food sales. So essentially the thought there is with a qualified exemption that they're going to have less of an impact than a lot of the large farms that are wholesaling just because they're not quite selling as much food, so they would have less of an impact. So that is a qualified exemption. And I wanted to mention some figures that FDA has provided, and essentially they estimate that in totality of the U.S., in the total U.S., there's about 189,000 total produce farms, and they estimate that about 54,000 of them, so the vast majority are going to be exempt or not covered by the produce safety rule. So that leaves about 35,000 farms that are going to be covered. And but I did want to mention again that even though growers might be exempt from the regulation, we are still recommending that these growers enact the recommended practices just because the exemption can be pulled if in case of an outbreak. And we're also expecting that this is going to be sort of a baseline marketing requirement. Right now, a lot of growers, like I mentioned, are having to undergo third-party audits, third-party good agricultural practices, or GAP audits, in order to sell to wholesalers. But we're recommending, or we're kind of expecting that compliance with the produce safety rule is going to be the baseline. So even if a wholesaler is not requiring an audit, they're requiring compliance with FSMA, no matter what the size of the farm is. So in the produce safety rule, there are several subparts. The final rule that came out in November was about 800 pages long. But the part that I really wanted to mention today is the biological soil amendments. This is probably the part that would most impact you guys, or might really be helpful for you to keep some of these recommended practices in mind as you're working with growers. Some of the other important aspects of the produce safety rule are worker health and hygiene. I'm going to talk a little bit about workers today, especially those that are in charge of working with soil amendments. Agricultural water, so this would be irrigation water, post-harvest water used for, in the packing house, used for washing produce. Domesticated and wild animals, this also includes working animals, for those of us who work with plainclothes growers who might use horses directly on the farm. It also includes harvesting practices, equipment sanitation, packing house sanitation, as well as the record-keeping requirements. And I'm going to, a little bit later, go over some of the record-keeping requirements that are recommended or required for working with soil amendments. Okay, so now that I give a brief overview of the produce safety rule, I also want to mention that if you are curious about some of the other parts of the produce safety rule that I'm not going to go over today, the FDA has a very nice, it's a nice fact sheet summarizing the produce safety rule. It's only about 3 pages, I believe, so, and it gives some of the key requirements for each of the other subparts that I'm not going to go over. Okay, so I wanted to give a little bit of a summary as to what we look at as, or what the produce safety rule includes as a soil amendment. Much of this is probably going to be very familiar to you all, or very basic knowledge, but just so that we're all on the same page as what is included in a soil amendment. Essentially, according to the FDA, they look at a soil amendment as any chemical, biological, or physical materials added to the soil to support plant growth and development. In addition to adding the nutrients that are required, that they also might reduce soil erosion, help build up tilth or build up the soil, and possibly reduce the sediment runoff as well. But from our standard, or from looking at it as a produce safety risk, these soil amendments can present risks, and we're not recommending that you stop using a lot of these soil amendments, but there are practices that you can incorporate that will really minimize those risks. So we're going to look at some of those risks today and come up with some potential practices that we can use to help minimize those risks. And when we're looking at soil amendments, the riskiest aspect of soil amendments are your biological soil amendments. So these are untreated, so we're looking at potentially raw manure, and essentially because these do come from an animal background, they can pose significant microbial risks. And also looking at different chemical or synthetic soil amendments, although we do look at them as they can impact food safety, usually the synthetic soil amendments, because they're made with such a high pressure and heat, they're very, very rarely pose a risk. So they tend to be sort of the baseline, the less risky way of using soil amendments. And then additionally, when growers are selecting and applying soil amendments, so when they're working on their nutrient management plan, or looking at where they're going to be using soil amendments, there are different practices that can be used to, and considerations that can be made when selecting and applying specific amendments to specific produce fields. Okay, so usually what we like to do is walk the growers through what we call a risk assessment. And these are sort of stepping back and asking a certain number of questions. And we have a decision tree available that I'll show you a little bit later that I can point you in the right direction of where you can find it. And we find it very helpful to give access to growers this decision tree because it really asks them question by question and points them in the right direction of what practices really that we recommend for certain soil amendment, certain occasions. So one of the big questions is that we often ask growers are, what type of soil amendments do you use? Raw manure being probably the riskiest, composted manure, synthetic soil amendments. These also might be things like table waste or table scraps. A lot of people are using green manure. And I wanted to mention here that biosolids are mentioned in the Produce Safety Rule. I didn't include any slides on them. However, biosolids, meaning human waste, are not recommended in the Produce Safety Rule. They're not allowed in the Produce Safety Rule, and I don't think I've run into any growers in Maryland that are using biosolids, so I left them out of this presentation. The reason that biosolids are very risky is that they can contain, because it is human waste, they can contain microbes, bacteria that work perfectly with the human body. So if ingested, there's a lot of viruses, heavy metals that are involved. So biosolids are not allowed in the Produce Safety Rule. A second question that we often ask are, what crops are you applying these soil amendments to? There's a big difference between fresh produce or agronomic crops. A lot of growers that I've worked with who are using raw manure, they tend to try to first use a raw manure on the agronomic crops, and then they'll sort of decide if they have any left to apply it to fresh produce, but they sort of try to use it on their low-risk crops first. Agronomic crops being those that are not eaten raw, so they would really be lower risk. Another question is, when are they applied, especially in Maryland with different nutrient management restrictions. It is difficult to apply raw manure early enough that it's really low risk when it comes down to harvesting them. For example, if they're growing an early season spinach crop, maybe they're harvesting it in late March or early April, they might really want to think about applying that raw manure in the spring and then harvesting, a couple of weeks later. That's not really recommended, just because the longer that the manure or the soil amendment is out in the field, the longer it has to die off, and the less risky it is. Another question is to think about is, how are these soil amendments applied? If they are using an untreated amendment, such as raw manure, we recommend that it's incorporated, and I think that might be a nutrient management recommendation as well. But we recommend that they're incorporated into the soil, and the reason being is that a lot of microbes that are potential human pathogens present in manure, they do not do a very good job of surviving in the environment. So if we are able to incorporate them into the soil, then a lot of the background microflora or background bacteria in the soil can outcompete them for nutrients and everything, and they'll fairly quickly die off. And then lastly, how much is applied and how often is it? Excessive application of certain soil amendments can lead to environmental impacts, such as in excessive nutrients. However, it can also lead to sort of changing the bacteria in the soil, and the more a certain soil amendment is applied into the soil, especially something as like an untreated manure, it can really start to change and modify the soil a little bit. So it can have these impacts. Okay, so I wanted to break down some of the different soil amendments that are commonly used, especially in Maryland. And I started with some of the lower risk amendments. And the first one I wanted to mention is chemical or synthetic soil amendments. These, like I mentioned, have a very minimal risk of human pathogens. Although they can't be considered 100% safe, there has been some research that shows that certain soil amendments, if you inoculate or if you were to somehow contaminate them with human pathogens. Certain soil amendments will do a very good job of growing those pathogens back up. So although they can't be considered 100% safe in comparison to some of the other soil amendments such as manure, they are very low risk. You still do want to think about the chemical risk to humans. And as always, make sure that workers are trained to apply, and if they are in charge of applying the soil amendments, make sure that they have training and that they're using personal protective equipment. Again, follow all labels, all application instructions, and make sure that these are being stored properly according to the label. I also wanted to mention pre-consumer vegetative waste. I don't find, in my experience in working with growers in Maryland, I don't find that this was extremely common, but I certainly did work, especially with some urban farming or some sustainable smaller farms. I found that this was kind of a growing option for soil amendments, and I wanted to point out that this is not table waste, this is pre-consumer. So this is any green waste that might be from food preparation, but this is before it gets to the consumer. Table waste is considered a little bit more risky just because you have potential viruses, norovirus, and some other potential microbes that the person consuming might have passed through. I did want to mention that vegetative waste is not considered zero risk. A lot of the growers I worked with say, you know, hey, it doesn't have animal manure in it or any animal byproducts, it's zero risk. They can still contain chemical hazards, physical hazards, especially, you know, maybe glass from packaging, some other things to consider. And then biological hazards can contain human pathogens. There was an outbreak a few years ago of hepatitis A from one of the food preparers. She had hepatitis and hadn't washed her hands properly enough, and it, because those preparation wastes, her preparing and then throwing out the scraps, some of this vegetative compost tested positive for hepatitis A, and they kind of were able to trace it back to that one kitchen person. I also wanted to mention, not from a human pathogen standpoint, but even from a plant pathology standpoint, I have heard some horror stories of working with culls and vegetative waste. If it wasn't composted properly, a lot of the plant pathogens were able to thrive, and then they kind of re-inoculated their fields with this green compost that had soft rot plant pathogens in it, and it sort of caused a huge issue in that following growing season. So we still recommend that, even though it's fairly low risk, that pre-consumer vegetative waste be considered, you know, fairly risky. I also wanted to mention some animal-based soil amendments that are non-manure. So these might be these are fairly popular in some of the organic farms that I've worked with. These might be bone meal, blood meal, feather meals, fish emulsion. These are generally considered low risk because they are processed. Usually they're processed, ground up, and heated at a high temperature. So these usually do not have human pathogens. But they should also still be considered in a food safety plan and when using them. Okay, so I briefly wanted to mention quickly some of the value of manure. I think when I sit in on produce safety talks, sometimes it seems like, especially depending on who's giving it, it seems like manure has zero value. And I think sometimes people need to realize that there is an issue if manure isn't allowed to be used on produce farms, that there's really an issue of getting rid of the waste. So one of the things that I find is that, especially with mixed farms, so farms that might have cattle or poultry, they just need to get rid of the manure sometimes and might as well use it for fertilizer, for nutrients, as opposed to sort of just wasting it. Forgive the pun. But manure does have a high value in increasing fertility, increasing soil tilth, water holding capacity, and it is very cost effective, and oftentimes it can be cheaper to use a manure if you have it as opposed to purchasing other sources of fertilization. So I wanted to mention in regards to animal manure, because I've worked with a lot of growers in Maryland that are using manure as their primary source of fertilizer. All manures can carry human pathogens, and it does kind of vary from animal to animal. For example, cows are a great carrier of E. coli. It is a microbe that we all have in our guts. However, they're pathogenic E. coli. Most E. coli are not going to help you or are not going to harm you. Most of them, for the most part, they just sort of help us digest and absorb nutrients in our gut, but there are some very nasty pathogenic E. coli. One of those that you've probably all heard of is E. coli 0157H7. That is a nasty pathogen that creates a toxin, and it causes people to shed bloody diarrhea, and it tends to not be a very nice one. So cattle are known for kind of being reservoirs, so they can be very good reservoirs of E. coli 0157H7. Poultry is, as you probably know, is a great reservoir for salmonella, and sheep also can have cyclospora, and it tends to vary. And one of the difficult things when working with produce safety and animal manure is that there are many factors that can really affect how animals shed pathogens, so how they kind of expel them in their manure. And a lot of this is kind of based on the farm, the rearing practices, the type of food that they're eating. There was an outbreak recently that was caused cattle out west. They were being fed, they were kind of on a sustainable grass-fed diet, and then the grower started feeding them brewer's grain, old brewer's grain, and that caused them to start shedding E. coli 0157H7 in huge amounts, whereas previously none of them were shedding it. So a lot of these factors are kind of difficult to quantify, but they do really affect how these pathogens are shed, as well as season, environmental conditions. Sometimes we hear about CAFOs and other kind of heavily concentrated animal operations shedding more manure. So there's a lot of factors that are really hard to quantify. So I wanted to mention in the produce safety rule, untreated soil amendments are, and again, those are that are not treated, they're not composted. These are considered in the produce safety rule. Also, aged or stacked manure. I used to get a lot of questions of people saying, you know, hey, I have this pile of horse manure out back, it's 20 years old, it's composted because it's 20 years old. And technically, I'm going to go into composting next, but technically that's not compost, it's still considered raw manure. Even though it's probably cured because it's so old, there's a good chance that there's no human pathogens in it. We still look at that as being raw manure because it hasn't gone through that scientifically validated process. Additionally, just slurries made out of untreated manure, teas, and these can be even if it's a tea that is made with a compost, that's still considered kind of an untreated soil amendment. And then also I've heard a lot of stories of people kind of treating their compost with raw manure. So they'll back add some raw manure into a finished compost. And unfortunately, that's kind of just like re-inoculating your compost. It's just like adding in those pathogens again. So those are all considered raw manures, kind of in the eyes of produce safety. And I'm going to go over some of these in the next couple of slides, but ways to reduce the risks of soil amendments, selection, so site selection, treatment, timing of application, the interval, the amount of days that you allow between applying the manure and harvesting the crop, the way it's applied, how much you're applying, and then proper handling and storage can go a long way in reducing contamination of the manure or cross-contamination between your manure or biological soil amendment and the crops that you're working with. So I wanted to mention composting. This is viewed in the produce safety rule as a very well-regarded, viable means of reducing the risk that manure has. Unfortunately, composting can be expensive if you purchase it, or it can be very time-consuming. So there's a lot of discussion going on about how to work with growers to either teach them composting or really ways to incorporate composting into their growing operation as a way to minimize that chance of cross-contamination. So I wanted to define composting because, like I mentioned before, it's that controlled biological process. It is a scientifically validated process. Technically, composting, the primary reason for doing it is it's decomposing organic matter, reduces pathogens. It's also considered a more stable nutrient source. But in the eyes of Preduce Safety, we're really looking at that reducing pathogen aspect of it. Usually when composting happens, we're looking at aerobic composting or static pile composting. So you're getting the temperature increase. So the temperature is shooting up, and a lot of human pathogens are not fans of high temperature. So as soon as that temperature increases to over 130 degrees or so for a sustained amount of time, most of those human pathogens are going to be killed off. And that's allowing a lot of the other good bacteria to flourish and grow and outcompete those pathogens. And I wanted to mention that when we're looking at composting as a treatment for treating soil amendments, monitoring and record keeping are incredibly important. So I kind of briefly go over this slide here. Two of the major validated processes outlined in the Preduce Safety Rule and FSMA, and these are also pertinent for GAPS, or Good Agricultural Practices, as well, are either using aerated static composting. So this is an aerobic process. It sits at a minimum of 131, often it's higher, degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days or so, and you have oxygen either diffusing in or being pushed in. So this is still an aerobic process, even though it's not being turned. And the more common practice that I usually see in composting is your turned composting. This is also known as windrow composting. You can see it in the photo. This is also an aerobic process. Human pathogens generally are not a fan. They do not survive well under aerobic conditions. And then turning it also does a good job of distributing that heat so you don't get any compost fires. Distributes the heat and makes sure that all of the manure or what you're composting is kind of being heated up. And the Preduce Safety Rule does mention a couple of other controlled composting processes. They're not quite as, I don't see them quite as common. And I did want to mention, in regards to composting, one of the questions I get, especially from sustainable or smaller urban growers, are what about vermicomposting? And that is allowing worms, so it's using worms to compost your soil. There's a lot of research that's actually being done on vermicomposting right now, but it's generally viewed that because the worm's gut is not capable of breaking down or killing those human pathogens. So far some of the preliminary research has shown that there are equal amounts of equal levels of human pathogens in the compost before and after it's kind of composted by that worm. So what a lot of growers will do if they still want to do vermicomposting is they will first aerobically compost that treatment, that manure, and then they'll allow the worms to go through, so you get the benefits of both. And it also lowers the level of human pathogens in that compost. So I wanted to mention some of the risks during application, and this is really for any type of soil amendment that is being used. We often recommend that growers preferentially apply soil amendments containing more to crops not included or not intended for fresh consumption. And I know a lot of the growers I work with kind of really already do that. So they are trying to apply it to their cabbage or their agronomic crops, or maybe their tree fruit if they're applying it when they are first bedding going to plant the trees, building their beds. So really to try to apply the soil amendments to crops that are low risk or that are, not going to be eaten raw. Again, maximizing the time between application and harvest. This can be difficult, especially with some of the nutrient management guidelines in Maryland. And then also, it's important to not contact the edible portion of the crop during application. So again, like I mentioned, if you maximize the time between application and harvest, you really shouldn't be side dressing, or you really shouldn't be contacting that edible portion of the crop. That's probably the biggest thing that we recommend not to do. And then also, we've heard some horror stories of neighbors spreading raw manure when the grower is about to harvest their leafy greens. So it's easier to do on the farm, but as opposed to working with neighbors, but trying to minimize risks to adjacent produce crops if you're field spreading manure. So maybe you can have a windbreak or have a far enough distance. Make sure that you're not spreading manure or other soil amendments on a windy day. Kind of common sense, but things like that. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about what specifically the Produce Safety Rule says in terms of application intervals for raw manure. So in the Produce Safety Rule, originally in the original rule, in the original proposed rule, they recommended having an application interval of 9 months. So 270 days between applying that manure or any untreated soil amendment and harvesting the crops. So there was a lot of outcry because, as you can imagine, especially in Maryland with nutrient management guidelines, that meant that growers would have to really apply the fall before, and they just really wouldn't be able to use that 9-month interval and still use manure for growing something like vegetable crops. So what they ended up doing is they pulled that recommendation completely. So currently, for untreated soil amendments, there's no application interval for raw manure in the Produce Safety Rule. FDA kind of reserved that section, and they said that they're currently pursuing further research, and they estimated that they're going to have a new interval within the next 5 years. So they do want it to be science-based. Like I mentioned, it's really difficult because there are so many types of manure, and the manure microbial quality is so different between different animals and different types of growing operations. So that is something that they're waiting for further research. And for treated soil amendments, currently there's a 0-day application interval for compost. So for any treated soil amendments, they still recommend that you do not really side dress with compost. At least make sure that it does not touch the edible portion of the crop. But there is that 0-day application interval. Originally, they had a 60-day application interval in the original proposed rule, but they pulled that along with the untreated soil amendment interval, and it's currently 0-day application. So I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that even though in the Produce Safety Rule there's currently no application interval, that does not mean that growers should say, okay, well that means it's 0 days and apply manure the day before they harvest baby spinach in the field. So what we are kind of recommending is that growers still stick by the National Organic Program 120-day or 90-day intervals. And if anybody's unfamiliar with those, in the National Organic Program, and this is also a number generally accepted by Good Agricultural Practices or GAP audits, a lot of growers are currently using 120 days. So they are waiting 4 months or 120 days between applying raw manure and harvesting that crop. And that's if the manure can come in contact with the crop. 90 days for something like sweet corn, that is a little bit lower risk. It's up off the ground. So FDA said in the Produce Safety Rule that they would not object to people using the NOP rule. So that's what we're still recommending from a GAP standpoint as the interval. Excuse me. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the handling recommendations that we And some of these are specifically written into the produce safety rule. Others are recommendations that we like to recommend to reduce risk. But one of the big things, and this is especially when I talk with small growers who don't have the resources, they might have one tractor, they have a compost pile in the back. In the morning they take the bucket loader and they turn the compost, so temperature gets distributed evenly, and then they hose down that bucket, and then they go and use it for something on the farm, for carrying bushels of crops. So something that we really recommend is that they either, if they're able to, they have specific equipment and tools for handling soil amendments. I have a grower recently that I've worked with that purchased a very small windrow turner. So instead of using his bucket loader, he has that specific equipment. If that's not possible, then the next step is to develop standard operating procedures. So develop SOPs or a process to clean and sanitize equipment and tools. So that might be cleaning and hosing down and scrubbing and then bleaching any equipment that you're using. And that's very important if you can't have specific equipment. Another thing is directing traffic around the soil amendment storage or processing areas. And so this might be training your workers or asking people to, take the long way around and not cutting directly over your concrete pad where you're storing manure. And another thing I wanted to bring up, that in this photo, you can see I get a lot of questions of, well, what about clothing? And that's a very good point. If possible, have a specific set of muck boots that you're using specifically for working with soil amendments or when you're turning your compost or moving your manure. And then hopefully you can either change clothes before you go to work in your produce fields, or you can at least have a boot bath or something and hose them off, scrub them down, and bleach your boots. Additionally, some storage area recommendations, and this can be for manure or compost. Make sure that hopefully growers are able to, and this is a big part of, I believe, nutrient management as well, is sort of minimizing leaching and minimizing runoff. But from a microbial standpoint, minimizing runoff, leaching, wind drift, and a good way to do that is either covering piles. This also is very helpful if you're composting, because it helps cover kind of the greenhouse effect. It increases the temperature enough to the high levels that you want to kill off pathogens. I've also seen some really nice berms built to prevent runoff. So, if you don't have the luxury, if you have a huge pile, you're not able to cover it. Hopefully some berms will divert water, and it'll at least divert it away from your produce field. You can see here in the lower photo is a picture I've taken. You can't quite see, but beyond between that manure pile or compost pile and the greenhouse is a nice little spinach field. So that was also kind of downhill a little bit. So every time it rained, we got a little bit of runoff into that field. So the next year, that grower decided to move his manure pile. Don't store in certain locations that might experience runoff or close to water sources, especially if that water source is being used to irrigate your crops. That's a great way to get really high levels of E. coli in your water source that you will then need to deal with. Also, minimize cross-contamination between raw manure and compost. Try to keep them in separate areas. And when you are handling them, try to, if growers are turning their compost, try to start with the most finished compost first, and then move down to working with the least compost, or the most raw. And that will help you minimize cross-contamination between those different piles. And also try to minimize animal access to the compost piles. I know dogs and vermin and all love playing in compost. It's a great source of fun and nutrients for them. But try to minimize that access, and it'll prevent the recontamination of that compost that's now pretty clean. I also wanted to mention a little bit about worker training. I always look at worker training being incredibly important in produce safety, just because workers are kind of the boots on the ground people. And I know when using soil amendments, it kind of depends on the size of the farm, but a lot of times the grower is going to be the person that's doing the composting or soil amendment handling. But if you do have workers, this might include family members, who handle soil amendments, make sure that they are taught the SOPs. So make sure that they understand the processes for turning the compost, for cleaning and sanitizing any equipment that's being used for the compost, especially if it's used somewhere else on the farm afterwards. Make sure that the workers' clothes, boots, and gloves are clean before handling produce. So hopefully maybe they can deal with the compost or soil amendments at the end of the day. Sometimes that's just not practical, so maybe they can either have a set of clean clothes and boots before going into produce fields, or at least clean off. And also making sure that they wash their hands after handling, and then also kind of standard worker hygiene that I'm not mentioning here today, but make sure that they wash hands, after using the restroom and eating and everything. Okay, so I wanted to go into a little bit of record keeping. These are the record keeping requirements under the Produce Safety Rule. And as required in the Produce Safety Rule is records on the type and source of soil amendment applied. So this might be from the species of animal. If you have different manure from different animals, it might be mixed. Most importantly, under the Produce Safety Rule is the rate and date of application. Because if you write this down, then you can count back the number of days and see how long until you can harvest. For example, if growers are falling under that NOP rule, that 120 days. Treatments, certificates of analysis, and any microbial test results. Microbial testing of composting and manure is not required in the Produce Safety Rule, but if a grower is purchasing compost, so say they're buying compost from a local composter, or if they are buying something like Perdue pellets, the processed pelletized poultry litter, then a lot of that compost should come with a certificate analysis, because a lot of times that composter, the supplier, will get it tested for human pathogens. So that's a good idea to keep, as well as your handling and sanitation practices. These are often written directly into the food safety plan. And here I have an example of a soil amendment. We have a lot of records for produce safety, not just using soil amendments online, and I can show you where to find them. This is just one example, and you can see it has the date, the location, so the plot. A lot of growers that I've worked with use the same plot designations as they do in their nutrient management plan. It just makes sense to use the same labels. And then crop, quantity used, so that would be your rate, the type of soil amendment, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of growers I've worked with use this chart specifically because it's already made, so they like it. They don't have to make their own. Others will actually just use a calendar. So they will say, March 16th or so, we applied manure, and then they also write down, September 1st, we harvested our tomatoes. And that shows that they're within that, or they're over that 120-day interval, so that's completely fine. So it doesn't have to be a difficult record. Sometimes a calendar is just easier. It depends on how much the growers like record keeping, which is usually not a lot. So record keeping for compost, since the composting we're doing that scientifically validated process, there is some record keeping and monitoring that's required. This includes time, temperature, the number of times and how often it's been turned, and any other processing steps that you might use. And this is an example of a compost process log. So you can see there's the date, temperature. It recommends taking the temperature in several places, just because depending on how well it's been turned, it might have a wide temperature range, or hopefully it's all fairly accurate, fairly spot on. And again, this is just one example of a record. This is not the one that's required. And lastly, I wanted to mention record keeping for suppliers. So this is if a grower is purchasing their compost. And I believe some of these might overlap with organic program, and a lot of these might overlap with nutrient management. So luckily some growers are able to use these records for more than one program that they're a part of. But documentation from the supplier, if you're purchasing your manure, should be kept of the name and address of the supplier. A lot of times people will just hold onto receipts or invoices, soil amendments, the date and amount purchased, and the lot information. The lot information, if it's available, it can be helpful just because if there is an outbreak or if some kind of recall has to happen, it makes it very easy to go back and see, trace back to the soil amendment used, because sometimes that might be the one at fault. And then documentation from the supplier, like I mentioned, oftentimes the compost will come with a sort of a certificate of completion. So that might be a microbial test, or if you don't have that certificate, you can hold on to, they might send the log with them. So this might be how often it's been turned and that temperature monitoring that I already mentioned. Okay, so things don't always go quite the way that you planned. So what are some of the corrective actions that can be taken? And a lot of times this is already included in a grower's produce safety plan. The reason being it's sometimes a lot easier to think about some of your corrective actions before they're required, because then you can have a plan to fall back on. So some of the steps that can be taken if the soil amendments pose a microbial risk to the crop. This might be, if your neighbor did apply manure, next adjacent to your baby spinach field. What if you find out that soil amendment's been improperly treated? So maybe for some reason a microbial test gets done and it comes back that the compost was high in human pathogens. What are you going to do about it? So getting growers to think about this a little bit before the problem might actually occur. One of the options is to think of an alternative market. I know some growers that one of their workers accidentally put on raw manure, fairly close to being harvested, so they ended up sending that produce to a processing market. So it ended up being processed. It involved a kill step, so then they still were able to make money on that crop. Just it was just a different market than they would have sold it to. And then also these corrective actions can be documented in their food safety plan. Okay, so I wanted to mention some of the resources available for making some of these management decisions from a food safety standpoint. And one of these is we have a whole set of decision trees. I am showing the one specific to soil amendments, but we have, I think it's about 8 different decision trees. And they're specific to water quality and all portions of a food safety plan. And essentially, the soil amendment one, it asks step-by-step questions. What type of fertilizer is being used, the storage facilities, things like that. And based on your answers, it helps give you ideas of how you can write that into a produce safety plan or a food safety plan. Each of the decision trees also comes with a log. This does not have to be the log that has to be used, but it's just a suggestion. And in my experience with working with a lot of growers, if you give them something that is fairly ready to use, they're going to use it because they would rather not make their own, which I completely agree with. So these are some options for them that can be used. Oops. Okay, so as I wrap up kind of some of the recommendations and requirements in the produce safety rule, I wanted to talk about a little bit about the Produce Safety Alliance and who we are. So I'll ask for questions at the end, but if any of you guys have questions on some of the practices that I discussed, feel free to ask me now and I'll address them. So until any questions come in, okay. we have a question that says, we have several producers planting into plastic for weed control. Is this practice considered a lower risk since the leaves and fruit are not coming into direct contact with soil amendments? That is a really good question. So using plasticulture, it is considered a lower risk, just because, like you said, the leaves and fruit are not coming into direct contact. And one of the other things is rain splash. So I didn't really mention this, but one of the big ways that contamination can occur if you're dealing with something like tomatoes that are staked that aren't necessarily growing on the ground like cantaloupes might be. So tomatoes are staked, they might be growing a couple of feet off the ground. One of the big ways that contamination can happen is rain splash. So, you know, the rain comes down and it splashes bacteria up onto the leaves or the fruit. So using plasticulture or plastic for weed control can really help minimize that. But I would also recommend that I wouldn't use that. That is a good way to reduce risk. I would not recommend not using that raw manure interval or properly composting and relying on plasticulture as a solution. So it would be a good thing that as long as you're following that interval, it's an additional way to minimize that microbial contamination. Okay, so I see an additional question. I'm going to keep going, and I'll get to your question on the record-keeping sheets shortly. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the Preduce Safety Alliance. I started in September after coming from University of Maryland, and we are a cooperative agreement between Cornell University, the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, and the USDA. We've been around since 2010, and even though I was not specifically working for Preduce Safety Alliance, I was still collaborating with them. We're primarily focused on outreach and education, and we're really working with growers to help meet the regulatory requirements. We're trying to help make sure that the barrier from these regulatory requirements is kind of as low as possible. So we're hoping even those growers that are exempt will help do some of these recommended or required practices. So our major role is, and what we've been working on since 2010, is to develop a standardized educational curriculum. So as proposed in the rule, and I have a blurb of it written up here, is that at least one supervisor from the farm must complete a food safety training at least equivalent to the standardized curriculum recognized by the FDA. So that is a bit of a, you can tell that it's an FDA regulation, the way that it's worded, but essentially that one person from each farm will need to attend a food safety training, either the standardized food safety training or an equivalent one. So the Preduce Safety Alliance we're developing and about to release a standardized curriculum. So we will be launching it nationwide, and we're going to be working, I have a few slides on University of Maryland Extension. We're going to be working very closely with UMD Extension to help make this curriculum available in Maryland. And I want to mention that even though we're the standardized curriculum, there are going to be equivalent curricula. The FDA just hasn't really stated what they are yet or how somebody can get their curriculum approved. So we're also working on, we have a lot of collaborators that I work with. We are trying to not reinvent the wheel, so we're trying to collaborate with as many regions as possible to provide region-specific and state-specific trainings. We're also working on training trainers, so we have a curriculum for extension folks and industry folks, academia, regulatory people to build up this team of qualified instructors. Okay, so our curriculum is going to be 7 hours of, it's unfortunately a long training. However, it's going to hit on the major aspects that you see here, of which soil amendments is one of them. Completion of this training does result in a certificate from a course certificate, so that people, it's a one-time training, and then growers sit through it once and then they have their certificate and they're set. So I'm going to move forward, and I'm going to stop here. That's sort of where I set my Preduce Safety Alliance hat down, and I'm going to pick up my old University of Maryland hat. So unfortunately, Chris Walsh could not make it today. He's at the Hershey meetings up in Pennsylvania. But he had asked me to talk a little bit about some of the Maryland-specific resources that are out there. And one of the things that or I guess they've been working on, I should say now, for the last 5 or so years is we have a specialty crop grant. It's through the Maryland Department of Agriculture, and we do a lot of gap trainings. I'm going to share, we have, they just finalized the winter training schedule for this year. So we are providing a lot of gap trainings, and this includes a lot of sitting down with a computer, and we try to get people to write risk assessments, we give them a kind of a template for a food safety plan, and in addition to sitting through presentations, we try to work with them so that they can write their food safety plan while we're there to talk to them. We've also released some fact sheets and publications on implementing GAPS programs, and then one of the big things that I think a lot of growers find most helpful is the one-on-one assistance. So this used to be my position, so I can talk it up. But now Justine Ballou, who unfortunately she could also not make the rescheduled webinar, but this is her contact information, and I will give it to you again in a couple of slides. But essentially, she is a contact. She will, if a grower has issues with writing a food safety plan or just doesn't know where to start, she will show up with a laptop and help sort of sit at the kitchen table and help sit through writing the food safety plan, talking about risks, and doing those risk assessments. I wanted to highlight our Preduce Safety website. I know this, unfortunately, it's sort of an awkward address. However, you can either write it down, or if you type into Google Walsh, W-A-L-S-H, Paul, P-A-H-L, lab, then you will find that website. And you can also navigate through if you prefer that way. But if you just Google this Walsh and Paul lab turn that you see on the left, you will pop right onto this website. And essentially, we have a lot of resources compiled. Some of these are resources for our specific Good Agricultural Practices program. We have a state-specific program. It provides the audit, a skeleton food safety plan, and that's both in a PDF and a Word document. So growers can download it, open it up on a Friday evening with a beer, and start writing out their food safety plan. There's also a list of Maryland water testing labs that they can get their microbial water tests done at. And we also started posting a variety of videos. Some of these are fairly in-depth, like how to take a water test, how to use chlorine bleach. That's more of the post-harvest sanitizing end. And then there's also a series of videos, kind of how-to videos on YouTube that are broken down into sections. And I couldn't quite fit it on here, but there's also some research that we've done in the past, microbial water surveys and some other training evaluations research that are also at the bottom of the page. They're kind of outlined there. So that's a really good place to get to send growers for more information. At the bottom of the website, we also link to the Maryland Department of Agriculture website, and they can find more information on auditing programs there. Okay, so I am going to kind of quickly go through these slides. If you have more questions on this, there's a nice little fact sheet on the website that I just showed you. But essentially, a GAP audit is a third-party audit. Growers are sometimes asked to do it by their wholesaler, so depending on who they're selling to, they're asked to do these GAP audits. And in Maryland, we have 3 major audits that they're audited on, and the Maryland Department of Ag, or MDA, does all of these audits. And the first one, sort of, if you look at it as a rung of a ladder, the first one is the MDA GAP audit. There's more information on the website about this, but essentially this is an educational audit. You still get, the grower, if they ask for it, they still get a certificate, but it is free. It is covered by grant funding. So this is where we usually recommend that growers start at, is the MDA GAP audit. And a lot of buyers in Maryland, we've talked to them, and a lot of them are accepting that audit kind of as a stepping stone educational audit before they pursue the USDA GAP or USDA harmonized GAP audits. So Wegmans, Giant, a lot of those are accepting this MDA GAP audit as a stepping stone. And MDA also provides, we have a really nice partnership between UMD and MDA. Part of the grant also is they provide some nice cost share assistance. So if a lot of times growers are concerned because getting the audits can be expensive, if they want the USDA GAP or harmonized GAP audit, it's $92 an hour, and that's what they have to charge. It's a federal rate. So there's grant money available to reimburse producers, so that first $400 of certification costs is free, and then any costs over that $400, 75% of those costs are reimbursed as well. So because getting a produce safety audit is usually not something growers look forward to, they've really tried to minimize that barrier to entry. So they've really tried to provide some of this cost sharing to help with that. So this information will be available on the website that I showed you, or feel free to contact me if you have questions about it. But this is the 2016 schedule that they just set earlier today, actually, for the Maryland GAP trainings, and they're hosting 5 trainings. They're scattered all throughout Maryland. There will be one on the Eastern Shore, actually 2 on the Eastern Shore, one in Queenstown, one in Salisbury, one in Boonesboro, one in Leonardtown in Southern Maryland, and one in Westminster. So feel free, I'm going to put contact information up next, so feel free to contact one of us if you are interested, or if you have growers that have questions about any of these. This information with a registration link will be on the website. Okay, so I know I'm running close on time. I just wanted to show you some of the Maryland Produce Safety Program contacts. From the University of Maryland side, so this is more the extension side, helping to write a food safety plan, is Justine. Feel free to write down her email address or her phone number. And then also from the Maryland Department of Agriculture, so this is more of the regulatory side, the auditing side is Deanna Baldwin. Her information as well is there, but they work very closely together, so if you have a question or a grower has a question, feel free. They'll just kind of talk back and forth, so feel free to contact either one of those. And then the last thing I wanted to end on was putting my Produce Safety Alliance hat back on. My contact information is down at the bottom, Donna Paul. So feel free, if you have any questions after this, feel free to contact me. If you have questions about Maryland, I can point you in the right direction, or if you have questions on the national curriculum or the anything that the Produce Safety Alliance does. And we do have a website. It's produceSafetyAlliance.cornell.edu. We are currently rebuilding it, so it does work, but depending on where they are today, it might look a little bit different. But we do have a general listserv that we send out extension information and sort of collaboration if we hear of any exciting new research. So feel free to join that listserv by clicking on that strawberry banner. We're on Facebook, and that is all. So feel free to contact me if you have any questions, but that is all that I had to present. And I did want to answer a couple of questions that I see. Somebody asked, where are the record keeping sheets for farmers on the website? If you go to gaps.cornell.edu, let's see, there are 2 links for the decision. It's called the decision tree. So if you click through the decision tree, you will be able to get to those record keeping sheets. There's also a little blurb on that gaps.cornell.edu website that I'm not looking at it right now, but I believe there's an education, and there's a whole slew of extension and record keeping sheets on there. But if you can't find it, feel free to send me an email and I can send you the exact link. The next question is using pond water to irrigate. That's a whole webinar in and of itself. I partially joke, but if a grower wanted to use pond water to irrigate, what they would have to do is get a series of E. coli test done, and that's generic E. coli. The test is about $35 each. It's taking a water sample, getting it sent in, and they count, you know, the number of E. coli in the sample. And essentially there is kind of a threshold that they're allowed to have, but we have a fact sheet on it actually. If the person asking sends me an email or actually writes in their email, I can make sure to send it to you.